Let's take an honest look at what 2024 was for Alabama's first year under Kalen DeBoer. And let's also take a quick peek ahead at what 2025 could be and maybe the task at hand for our good friends in Tuscaloosa. If you're one of our good friends in Tuscaloosa, you're just an Alabama fan, make sure you're subscribed right here to the On3 YouTube channel. College football year round, nothing but college football. You're a sicko, we're sickos. Glad to have you part of this thing, man. So last year was, to state the obvious, below expectations for what Alabama football has come to expect. Obviously, Nick Saban retires. It sends a ripple effect across the college football world. Kalen DeBoer gets hired to be your guy. Now, it's very easy to sit here in hindsight and say, well, Saban was gone. Of course, they didn't achieve what they expected to. But in the moment, remember what Kalen DeBoer was leaving when he left Washington, a team that had just competed for a national championship and beaten Texas on their way to doing it and beaten Oregon twice on their way to doing it. There was a lot of confidence internally in Tuscaloosa that they wouldn't miss a beat. And to be real, y'all, I don't blame you for having that expectation. I don't blame you for thinking that, because in the moment, it was a very reasonable case to make. However, with the way that things worked out in Tuscaloosa, Kalen DeBoer takes the job in January, and it felt like, and I've said this before, it felt just very clunky. It felt like things were never totally off on the right foot for Kalen DeBoer. My overarching statement here is I don't think you can judge Kalen DeBoer purely off what you saw in his first season in Tuscaloosa. Why? Because I don't think what he had on the field is something he would sign his name next to and say, yep, we did our best. That was my best. That's what I expected us to look like. Let's move forward here. That's not what he's saying. He's saying, yeah, it was a little bit, I would imagine he's saying this behind closed doors, yeah, it was a little bit of a weird way to get the job and a weird way for my career to start with, 33% production back on defense. The portal, it just bodies our roster. Yeah, it wasn't ideal. But now having a full season underneath him, I think 2025 you can have some cause for optimism. And one of the reasons why I feel that way is I saw a lot of flashes last year from Alabama, even with the clunkiness, even with the fact that you had a quarterback in Jalen Milroe who maybe wasn't the perfect fit for what you want to do offensively, a guy who's historically averaged 20 attempts a game through the air, and you pair him with a Kalen DeBoer offense that averages 40 attempts a game. I digress. You didn't have your offensive coordinator in Ryan Grubb. He was in the NFL at that point in time. He will be there next year in Tuscaloosa. And your best receiver on your team, every broadcast in America beat it into your skull that he was 17 years old. He's now 18, but you hear the point. Alabama as a whole was just not tailored to what Kalen DeBoer wanted to do offensively last year. And they played a lot of young bucks on defense, and they had a lot of flashes, like I mentioned, but there's still, I think, a lot to account for when you try to take inventory properly of what 2024 was. But speaking of those flashes, like the Georgia game, we were all saying afterwards, whoa, like Kalen DeBoer might be up to something in Tuscaloosa. I think that was real. I think that game plan he prepared for Georgia was superior to what Kirby Smart had. I think the juice they approached that game with was indicative of the way they believe in Kalen DeBoer and the buy-in. And also, the season is going how it's going at that point in time, and you roll on forward, and you have to go play LSU at night. Again, high-stakes game. At this point, you've lost to Vanderbilt. At this point, you're still trying to pick up all the pieces of what the season is and trying to rebound a little bit, but you go into Death Valley and beat the brakes off LSU. Not a lot of teams can say they've done that. And whether Brian Kelly's the coach or otherwise, like that in itself, I think, was a feat. So I mentioned all the things that Alabama didn't have going their way. Let's also take account of the just psychology of the situation, because the roster is the roster. Jalen Milroe, again, I don't think he's the exact prototype for what Kalen DeBoer wants at quarterback long term, but the psychology of Nick Saban no longer being the head coach, I think we saw show itself very subtly in two different ways, both externally and internally. Externally, Cato made a great point before we started the show. Whenever you had to play Alabama previously, you had to account for the Saban effect a little bit. Now, Saban's not out there with you one-on-one on an island giving you man coverage with him playing corner, but you know what I'm saying. There was this feeling of, we got to bring it with this Nick Saban coach team, and even if we feel good about our game plan, even if we feel good about our roster and our matchups, it's still Nick Saban. There's a little bit, I think, of anxiety might not be the exact right word, but I think it fits for this discussion. You have some anxiety playing Nick Saban. I think that's a fair way to say it. But now you subtract him from the equation. Not only is there more optimism of, well, now they're more gettable because he's no longer the head coach, there's a real sense of belief. Like, I guarantee you, there were dudes going into games this past season against Alabama saying, this is my first real chance where I actually have a lot of confidence in what we can do in terms of how we stack up against the Alabama team. Why? Because Saban's not there. Like, the roster is what the roster is, but Nick Saban not being there, I think the target's already on your back in Tuscaloosa given that script A. But, the bullseye was, I think, accentuated by the fact that Saban was no longer the head coach. That's the external part. The internal part for me is something that I don't totally blame Kalen DeBoer for right now. It was just kind of a product of the way that he got the job and the way the portal works. I don't think we've even seen Kalen DeBoer's culture be solidified just yet. Now, obviously, it's year one, so it's probably going to take a little bit longer than 1 year for any coach to get their culture in place. But you saw with Saban's Alabama, they would stumble if that were to happen. And then if you had to play them the week after a loss, we were all collectively saying a prayer for you across the college football community because they were about to beat your absolute brains in. That was what they were going to do. And this past year, Alabama loses to Vanderbilt. It's embarrassing. It's the story of not just college football, but the sports world for the better part of that week. And then they go back home and eke out a win against South Carolina. Now, South Carolina is a good football team. I think South Carolina has as good a case as anyone to be in the college football playoff a year ago. Y'all know I'm high on Lenore Sellers. But the point being, South Carolina hadn't yet evolved into what they were going to be down the stretch in that season, and that just felt very, again, un-Bama-like to me. I think a solidified Kalen DeBoer culture probably responds in a better fashion to that Vandy loss. Now, you still won the game, but it was something we sort of saw semi-consistently, like handling success and handling failure just wasn't something we saw this team be enormously proficient in. Like the win over Georgia is a great example. Vibes are immaculate. You're the story, again, of the college football world. It's what comes with being that team in Crimson and Tuscaloosa. And you don't handle success the right way, and it ends up leading to a Vanderbilt loss. I mentioned the LSU. When you beat LSU and vibes are awesome, you beat Mercer the next week, we keep rolling, and then we play Oklahoma, and we don't score an offensive touchdown. Yeah, it's the product of not having Nick Saban there anymore, but I think it's also the product of Kalen DeBoer still trying to get his culture firmly solidified across that locker room and across that building in Tuscaloosa. So the honesty part of this is it wasn't good enough last year. And there's a lot here that I don't think Kalen DeBoer is at fault for, but make no mistake, everything here Kalen DeBoer is still responsible for. And so the product that he's going to have to put on the field in 2025, we're going to continue to hold him to that high standard. There's no excuse here because Saban's not there. Nobody's saying, oh, well, the GOAT's gone. Of course they're going to fall off. Nobody in Tuscaloosa thinks that way. Nobody operates that way, and you shouldn't, based on your previous success and based on what you've come to expect of that logo that you wear on all your gear. So there's that part of it. One more thing I want to say is looking at 2025, it's not make or break for Kalen DeBoer. That would feel foolish to say. I still believe he's a great football coach, and he's proven he's a good recruiter with them having a top 3 class this past cycle. But when we talk about recruiting for Alabama, if they don't make the playoff in 2025, it doesn't break Kalen DeBoer, but it does chart out a much more uphill climb for him at Alabama when it comes to trying to achieve at the level they expect for Alabama. Because at that point, recruits are starting to ask, wait a second, Saban's gone. Year one, okay, you get your feet underneath you. I get it. The portal works how it works. I think recruits understand all that went on that wasn't totally functional last year for Alabama. But if it's 2 years in a row, then there's some real insecurity around Alabama and just what they are in the scope of college football, period, moving forward. That's not me telling you Kalen DeBoer can't still recruit at a high level. Not me telling you that they won't have success in the future. I did a video yesterday we did together on the show saying we think Alabama's set up for success in the top 10 of college football here moving forward. But if you don't make the playoff next year, you put yourself at a little bit of a disadvantage when it comes to trying to keep that standard of recruiting at the highest level that's made Alabama during the last 15 plus years. So, last thing I'll say, I told you that was the last thing I'll say. I got one more thing to say. None of us would want to be judged how we do the first year on our job, much less in a spot where you're following up the greatest to ever do it. So, expectations, fair, did not meet them last year. There's a lot built in, though, to me that is reason for optimism to pair with what was successful last year for Alabama here moving in to 2025. So, a lot of hypotheticals we're unpacking. It's the beauty of college football in February. We get to unpack hypotheticals and see how it all works, see how it all fits together when toe meets leather in the fall. Appreciate y'all being dialed in. Kalen on the ones and twos, myself, JD PicKell. We are going to keep this party rolling, and we will see y'all next time.